somewhere near Caen, Normandy, July 1944. A makeshift German proving ground had been established in a farm field, hastily cleared of rubble and positioned far enough from the front lines to avoid Allied artillery, but close enough that the rumble of distant guns provided constant background noise. A group of Worm artillery officers stood in a loose semicircle around a piece of American hardware that had been recovered 3 days earlier from an overrun position near Villers-Bocage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was an M2A1 105mm Howitzer. Olive drab paint scuffed but intact. White star stenciled on the shield still clearly visible. The barrel, elevated at a modest angle, caught the morning light. These men had seen captured equipment before. Soviet field guns, British 25-pounders, French artillery pieces, from 1940, some still bearing manufacturer stamps from the previous war. This was standard procedure in the Hilfswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Agency. Recover the weapon, transport it to a safe area, test it thoroughly, document its capabilities, file a report, perhaps salvage components if they proved useful. But what happened over the next 45 minutes would leave every officer present in stunned silence. A gun crew had been assembled from experienced Wehrmacht artillerists, men who had served from Poland to the Eastern Front, veterans who knew their trade. They began the standard firing drill: load, aim, fire. The first shell left the barrel with the familiar crack that all artillerymen recognize. A puff of smoke. The gun recoiled, returned to battery. Standard, then the second round, then the third. The shells kept leaving the barrel in a rhythm that seemed impossible for a weapon of this caliber. An Oberleutnant standing off to the side held a stopwatch, clicking it at each report. After the first minute, he glanced at his watch, frowned, and reset it. After the second minute, he called for the crew to continue. After 5 minutes, he stopped the drill and did the mathematics again, checking his figures twice. Then he looked up at his fellow officers, and someone finally said it out loud. They had never seen a howitzer in this weight class sustain this rate of fire. Not with this caliber shell, not with this level of consistency, not without the crew beginning to falter or the breech mechanism showing signs of strain. You might assume this is simply another chronicle of Allied material superiority. More guns, more shells, more trucks, more of everything. The Americans outproducing Germany 10-1. But this moment represented something that cut far deeper than mere logistics. Rate of fire in artillery is not a luxury specification. It is not a feature you add if you have extra engineering capacity. It is the fundamental difference between suppressing an enemy position before it can respond and giving that enemy time to take cover or return fire. It is the gap between delivering steel on target during the critical seconds when your infantry needs it most, and arriving 30 seconds too late when the opportunity has passed and your own soldiers are pinned down or dead. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German artillery doctrine in 1944 remained fundamentally rooted in principles established during the First World War and refined through the interwar period. The emphasis was on methodical precision, careful observation, deliberate registration of targets, adjustment fire. Then, and only then, fire for effect. The philosophy assumed that well-trained gun crews, working with well-engineered weapons, would deliver accurate fire through skill and discipline. Speed was secondary to precision. The German standard light field howitzer, the 10.5 cm Leichter Feldhaubitze 18, abbreviated as Le FH-18, was the backbone of divisional artillery. It was a proven, reliable weapon. Krupp engineered, battle-tested across every front Germany had fought on, respected by friend and enemy alike. Its specifications on paper were competitive with any comparable weapon in the world. It fired a 15-kilogram high-explosive shell out to a maximum range of 10,850 meters. Elevation could be adjusted from -6.5 degrees to 42 degrees. The gun could traverse 8 degrees left or right from its center position without repositioning the carriage, but the LEL FH-18 fired at a maximum rate of 4 to 6 rounds per minute under absolutely optimal conditions, and that assumed a veteran crew working in perfect coordination, with no incoming fire, no fatigue, and no equipment issues. In realistic combat conditions, the sustained rate dropped to 3 rounds per minute, sometimes 2. This was not a failure of German engineering or crew training. This was the physical reality of the weapon's design. The M2A1 Howitzer, sitting in that field near Cayenne, surrounded by skeptical German officers, was recording a sustained rate of fire that averaged 4 to 5 rounds per minute. Some crews, once they had established their rhythm, were pushing 6 rounds per minute, and the American gun did not seem to care whether the crew firing it was veteran or fresh from training. The weapon itself was engineered to facilitate speed. That realization, crystallizing in the minds of these German artillery professionals as they watched round after round leave the barrel in rapid succession, represented a psychological break more profound than losing a single battle. This was not about numbers or industrial capacity. This was about fundamental design philosophy. The Americans had not simply built more guns. They had built guns that operated according to different principles, guns that assumed speed and volume mattered more than the incremental improvements in accuracy that German engineers had spent decades perfecting. The context here is essential to understand. By July 1944, the Wehrmacht was fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts simultaneously. Every shell counted. Every second of fire superiority counted. Across Normandy, across Italy, and increasingly on the Eastern Front, where American Lend-Lease equipment was arriving in Soviet hands, German forward observers had been filing reports for months describing a disturbing pattern. Allied artillery, particularly American artillery, was not just bringing more tubes to bear. They were bringing tubes that fired faster, displaced more quickly, and seemed able to deliver coordinated fire with a speed that German batteries could not match. The psychological impact on the officers conducting this test would have been immediate and profound. These were men who had spent their entire military careers, in some cases their entire adult lives, perfecting a system, a doctrine, a methodology for delivering indirect fire. They had studied at artillery schools, they had practiced on ranges, they had commanded batteries in combat across multiple theatres. They understood their weapons intimately. They knew what was possible and what was not possible. And now they were watching a mass-produced American weapon, built by a nation that had barely possessed a standing army in 1939, systematically outperforming the pride of Krupp engineering on the single metric that mattered most in sustained combat operations. The rate of fire gap between German and American light howitzers was not immediately obvious when comparing specification sheets in a comfortable office. If you lined up the technical manuals in early 1943 and compared numbers side by side, the weapons appeared roughly equivalent. The Lee FH-18 threw a 15-kilogram shell to 10,850 meters. The American M2A1 lobbed a 14.97-kilogram projectile to approximately 11,445 meters. A range advantage existed for the American weapon, certainly, but it was not catastrophic. Shell weight was nearly identical, differing by less than half a kilogram. Both were towed weapons requiring a prime mover for displacement. Both used bag charge propellant systems with adjustable charges for different ranges. Both employed similar sighting and fire control methods. On the static comparison charts filed away in ordnance bureaus and examined by staff officers who had never heard a gun fired in anger, these were peer weapons. Competitive designs from two industrialized nations with sophisticated arms industries. But wars are not fought on specification sheets filed in cabinets. Wars are fought in 6-minute fire missions, where the side that delivers more high explosive downrange in less time controls the tactical outcome of that engagement. And in that environment, the M2A1 was not a peer weapon. It was a different class of system entirely. Wehrmacht artillery crews in 1944 were still trained under standards that had been developed in the 1930s and refined through campaigns in Poland, France, and the early years on the Eastern Front. The doctrine emphasized precision and fire discipline. Every shot was planned. Fire missions followed a rigid sequence that had been codified in training manuals and drilled into every gun crew from their first day at artillery school. First, observation. The forward observer identified a target and radioed coordinates to the Fire Direction Center. Second, calculation. Fire direction personnel computed firing data, accounting for range, elevation, propellant charge, wind, and temperature. Third, registration rounds. The battery fired deliberate single shots to bracket the target. Fourth, adjustment. Observers, called corrections, and fire direction recalculated. Finally, fire for effect. Only after this entire sequence had been completed did the battery commence sustained fire on the target. The LIF H-18's crew drill reflected this philosophy at every step. The breech operator opened the horizontal sliding block manually after each shot. The loader and assistant loader, working in careful coordination, manhandled the 15-kilogram shell into the chamber. The fuse setter adjusted each round individually based on the fire mission requirements. The powder man selected the appropriate charge and inserted it behind the projectile. The gun commander verified every step of the sequence before giving the order to fire. Under ideal conditions, with a rested crew, no incoming fire, proper ammunition supply positioned within easy reach, and a gun in good mechanical condition, a veteran German battery could sustain 3 rounds per minute per gun. Occasionally, for brief periods, they might achieve 4 rounds per minute. But ideal conditions had become increasingly rare by mid-1944. Crew fatigue from sustained operations. Inexperienced replacements filling positions left vacant by casualties. Ammunition shortages requiring careful rationing of every shell. Constant Allied air harassment that forced batteries to displace frequently. Under these real-world conditions, actual sustained rates of fire often dropped to 2 rounds per minute, sometimes less, and the carefully orchestrated fire mission sequence that German doctrine prescribed could take 10 to 15 minutes from initial observation to shells impacting the target. American artillery training had evolved along a fundamentally different path. The United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, had been refining its instructional methods since the 1920s, building on lessons learned from the First World War and from close observation of European developments. But the massive expansion of the American military after 1941 forced a complete re-evaluation of training priorities. The Army needed to transform hundreds of thousands of civilians into competent artillerymen in months, not years. The solution was standardization, simplified procedures, weapons designed to be operated effectively by soldiers with minimal training, and a doctrine that prioritized speed and volume of fire over the kind of precision that required years of experience to master. Officers attending Fort Sill were taught that massed fires, multiple batteries engaging the same target simultaneously, could shatter enemy formations before those formations had time to maneuver or take cover. That doctrine required guns capable of pumping out shells rapidly enough to maintain continuous suppression throughout the duration of the fire mission. The M2A1, which entered service in 1941 as the standardized American light howitzer, was engineered around this requirement from its inception. Its semi-automatic breech block opened automatically after firing, ejecting the spent powder case and cutting precious seconds from the reload cycle. The recoil system employed hydro-pneumatic buffers that absorbed recoil energy more efficiently than the spring-based systems common in earlier designs, allowing the gun to return to battery position faster and more consistently. The loading sequence, while still using separate shell and powder charge like German systems, had been streamlined and optimized. Crew training emphasized rhythm and repetition. Fort Sill instructors drilled their students relentlessly until achieving 4 rounds per minute became muscle memory, an automatic sequence requiring no conscious thought, not a heroic effort reserved for critical moments, not a theoretical maximum listed in a manual, but a standard, sustainable pace that any properly trained crew could maintain. British gunners, working with weapons like the Ordnance QF-25 pounder, had reached comparable conclusions through their own painful experiences. The North Africa campaign, particularly the grinding attritional battles at El Alamein, had taught Commonwealth artillery officers that German accuracy meant nothing if you could silence their observers with overwhelming volumes of fire first, before they could direct effective counter-battery fire onto your own positions. By 1943, British artillery doctrine explicitly prioritized rapid, sustained fire over pinpoint accuracy in most tactical situations. Commonwealth gun crews regularly achieved 3 to 4 rounds per minute with their field artillery, and their fire direction procedures had been simplified to enable faster response times. When those German test officers watched that captured M2A1 run through its firing drill in that Normandy field, they were not merely observing a faster gun. They were seeing the physical manifestation of a completely different philosophy about what artillery was supposed to accomplish on a modern battlefield. A philosophy that their own doctrine, their own training, and their own weapons had not evolved to meet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The design differences between German and American light howitzers reflected two nations that had absorbed opposite lessons from the First World War. Germany had emerged from that cataclysm convinced that artillery had been too crude, too wasteful, too imprecise. Millions of shells expended for minimal tactical gain. The Materialsschlacht, the battle of material, had been horrifying in its scale and seemingly inefficient in its execution. The solution, in the view of German military theorists in the 1920s and 30s, was precision, better optics, better training, better fire control procedures, quality over quantity. When Krupp engineers sat down in the Keitel, late 1920s, to design what would eventually become the Lef-18, they built a weapon optimized for accuracy and reliability. The gun carriage used a box trail design, a single rigid trail assembly that provided excellent stability during firing. This stability improved accuracy, but it also severely limited traverse. You could not quickly shift fire to a new target without physically moving the entire gun, unlimbering it from its current position, rotating it, and relimbering. For a battery to engage multiple targets in rapid succession required either accepting very limited traverse angles or conducting time-consuming gun movements. The recoil mechanism employed in the Lef-18 was reliable and well-proven, using a combination of spring buffers and hydraulic dampers. It worked, it was maintainable, it was thoroughly tested, but it was also conservative in its engineering, taking longer to return the barrel to battery position than more advanced hydro-pneumatic systems. The breech was a horizontally sliding wedge block, manually operated by the breech operator. It was robust, it was precise, it could be maintained under field conditions. It was also inherently slower than more modern designs. Every element of the Lef-18 design assumed that a well-trained gun crew would be the critical factor in artillery effectiveness. The sighting system featured excellent German optics, among the best in the world. But adjusting elevation and traverse required careful operation of handwheels, a process that took time and demanded concentration. The ammunition was manufactured to exacting quality control standards, ensuring consistent ballistic performance. But each shell had to be individually handled with care, and fuses had to be manually set for each fire mission. The gun could fire with different propellant charge combinations to vary range, giving the weapon considerable flexibility. But that flexibility came at the cost of operational complexity. Crew training emphasized performing every task correctly, methodically, professionally. Speed would come naturally with experience, or so the doctrine assumed. This design philosophy had worked brilliantly during the campaigns of 1939 through 1941, when German artillery supported rapid mechanized advances and rarely faced sustained counter-battery fire. Polish, French, and early Soviet artillery had been outmaneuvered or destroyed before they could bring their own weight of fire to bear. German guns could take their time, register targets carefully, and deliver precise fire in support of fast-moving panzer and infantry operations. But by 1943, the operational environment had changed fundamentally and completely. Static fronts in Italy and later in Normandy, attritional warfare on the Eastern Front, Allied air superiority that punished any German position that remained in place for extended periods. In this new environment, German artillery batteries needed to fire their missions quickly and then displace immediately before enemy counter-battery fire could arrive and destroy them. The Lef-H-18's methodical design philosophy, which had seemed professional and scientific in the 1930s, had become a dangerous liability. American engineers had approached the same artillery problem from an entirely different angle, one shaped by industrial and manufacturing perspectives rather than purely military tradition. The M2A1 program began in earnest in 1939, when the United States Army finally acknowledged that its existing 105mm guns, some dating back to the First World War, were completely obsolete and inadequate for modern warfare. The design team at Rock Island Arsenal studied captured examples and technical literature from both French and British designs, incorporating elements from both while adding their own innovations. The result was a weapon built from its conception for mass production and ease of operation. The carriage employed a split trail design, two separate trail legs that spread apart during firing. This configuration gave the gun a much wider traverse arc, up to 46 degrees without needing to reposition the entire weapon. This single design feature meant that American gun crews could engage multiple targets in rapid succession, simply traversing the tube from one firing solution to the next, while German crews had to physically reposition their entire gun between targets or accept firing at targets outside their limited traverse range. The M2A1's recoil system used hydropneumatic buffers with compressed air recuperators. When the gun fired, hydraulic fluid absorbed the violent recoil energy smoothly and progressively, while compressed nitrogen gas in the recuperator cylinder provided constant pressure to push the barrel back into battery position automatically and quickly. This system was faster and far more consistent across different temperatures and firing rates than spring-based mechanisms. It also required less field maintenance under combat conditions, a critical consideration for an army that would be operating thousands of these weapons simultaneously across multiple theaters. But the real breakthrough, the feature that most dramatically separated the M2A1 from its German counterpart, was the breech mechanism. The American howitzer used an interrupted screw breech with a semi-automatic operating feature. After the gun fired and recoiled, the breech block opened automatically as part of the recoil cycle and automatically ejected the spent powder case. The loader could immediately insert the next projectile without waiting for any manual breech operation. Once the shell was seated and the powder charge inserted, closing the breech was a simple, quick motion. This was not revolutionary technology in the abstract sense. The French had experimented with semi-automatic breech systems during the First World War, but American engineers had refined the concept to a point of absolute reliability, robust enough to function consistently even when operated by inexperienced crews under combat stress, in extreme weather, with minimal maintenance. Combined with streamlined crew drill procedures that had been carefully analyzed and optimized, the semi-automatic breech cut reload time nearly in half compared to manual breech systems. The M2A1 also benefited from careful attention to ammunition handling efficiency. It used separate loading ammunition, with the projectile and bagged powder charge loaded separately, a system that gave the crew flexibility to adjust range by using different charge increments. But the American bag charges were standardized, color-coded, and designed for rapid handling. They were lighter and easier to manipulate than rigid cartridge cases. They stacked efficiently in ammunition storage. They ignited consistently across wide temperature ranges. Crew positions around the gun had been ergonomically optimized, though that term was not yet in common use. Each crew member's duties and physical position were arranged so that their movements did not interfere with others. The loader worked on one side of the breech. The assistant loader positioned shells within easy reach. The powder man stood clear of the loading path. Everything about the weapon's design and the prescribed crew drill assumed that speed and sustained volume of fire mattered more than incremental improvements in precision. The first M2A1 howitzers fell into German hands during the North Africa campaign, though initially most of these captures occurred under circumstances that left the weapons damaged or incomplete. Operation Torch, the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942, introduced American artillery to the Mediterranean theatre for the first time. As United States forces pushed eastward through Tunisia during early 1943 to link up with British 8th Army advancing from Libya, chaotic engagements and rapid movements resulted in equipment being lost and recovered by both sides. Most of these early German captures were too damaged for meaningful technical evaluation. A direct hit from an 88mm anti-tank gun or a mine strike does not leave much intact to study. But when Axis resistance in Tunisia finally collapsed in May 1943 and more than 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered, large Allied supply dumps fell into German hands largely intact. Among the captured material were fully functional M2A1 howitzers, complete with ammunition stocks, technical manuals, and fire control equipment. The Heereswaffenamt had a well-established and systematic process for evaluating captured enemy weapons. Every major front maintained technical intelligence teams specifically tasked with recovering interesting equipment. Anything deemed significant was shipped back to Germany, usually to proving grounds at Hillersleben, near Magdeburg, or Kummersdorf, south of Berlin. These facilities had been testing artillery since the Imperial German Army era, and by 1943 they had evaluated Soviet 76mm divisional guns, British 25-pounders, American 37mm anti-tank guns, and various other Allied weapons systems. The evaluation process followed strict protocols. Initial static inspection to document specifications and design features, then live fire testing under controlled conditions, then detailed engineering analysis. Finally, comprehensive reports distributed to ordnance bureaus, training commands, and field headquarters. The M2A1 howitzers captured in Tunisia arrived at Hillersleben sometime in mid to late 1943. Initial reports focused on the obvious design features: the split trail carriage, the hydro-pneumatic recoil system, the semi-automatic breech mechanism. German engineers immediately recognized that this was a modern, thoughtfully designed weapon that incorporated several advanced features. But the real revelation came during the live fire testing phase. The Sicily invasion in July 1943 and the subsequent Italian campaign provided additional opportunities for German forces to capture American equipment. The fighting around the Salerno beachhead in September 1943 was particularly chaotic, with German counterattacks nearly succeeding in driving the United States Fifth Army back into the sea. In the confusion, both sides lost and recaptured equipment multiple times. At least 3 M2A1 howitzers were abandoned by American units during the initial beachhead crisis, then recovered by German forces before the Americans could destroy them. These guns came with something even more valuable than the hardware itself. They came with American ammunition still loaded in their ready racks and technical manuals still stored in their equipment boxes. The manuals were printed in English, but the Wehrmacht maintained large staffs of competent translators. More importantly, the manuals included detailed crew drill instructions, maintenance procedures, and critically, the official United States Army standards for rates of fire. 4 rounds per minute sustained, 6 rounds per minute for short-duration bursts. German test crews at Hillersleben initially assumed these published figures were propaganda, or perhaps theoretical maximums calculated under impossible ideal conditions that no artillery piece actually achieved in real combat. Everyone in the artillery community understood that published rates of fire were always optimistic, but when the test range assembled experienced German artillerists and walked them step by step through the American crew drill procedures, as described in the captured manuals, the published numbers proved to be entirely accurate. 4 rounds per minute was not theoretical. It was not propaganda. It was reliably, repeatedly, achievable with a properly trained crew following standard procedures. The test reports generated at Hillersleben in late 1943 and early 1944 documented these findings with characteristic German thoroughness. The test reports from late 1943 and early 1944 documented the M2A1's performance across multiple variables, measured with the kind of methodical precision that German engineering culture demanded. Engineers trained to document everything meticulously timed the weapon's recoil cycle from the instant of firing until the barrel returned fully to battery position. 2.4 seconds on average. The LFH-18, by comparison, required 3.8 seconds for the same cycle under identical test conditions. That extra 1.4 seconds might sound trivial when discussed in a classroom or read in a report. But multiply that difference across a 10-minute fire mission, across 6 guns in a battery, and you begin to see the practical combat implications. The difference between 40 shells downrange and 25 shells downrange. The difference between suppressing an enemy position effectively and giving that enemy time to respond with their own fire. The semi-automatic breach operation saved an additional 1.2 seconds per shot, compared to the manual operation required on the LFH-18. The German breach operator had to manually open the sliding wedge block, extract or allow the ejection of the spent case, then manually close and lock the breech before the gun could fire again. The American system eliminated most of this manual sequence, opening automatically and requiring only a simple closing motion once the next round was loaded. Add in the split trail traverse advantage, and the cumulative effect became even more pronounced. The M2A1 could shift 15 degrees left or right without moving the carriage, while the LFH-18 needed complete repositioning for anything beyond, approximately 4 degrees of traverse. In practical terms, this meant American batteries could engage multiple targets in rapid succession, simply traversing from one to the next, while German batteries were still unlimbering, shifting position, and relimbering between targets. The sustained fire tests conducted at Hillersleben were particularly revealing because they attempted to replicate actual combat conditions rather than simply measuring theoretical maximums. German artillery doctrine had always distinguished carefully between short burst fire rates and sustained fire rates, because both barrel heat accumulation and crew fatigue inevitably degraded performance over extended periods. The test protocols reflected this combat reality. Fire as rapidly as possible for 5 minutes to simulate an urgent fire mission, then maintain steady fire for 20 minutes to simulate sustained support of an infantry assault. Then measure how long the crew and weapon needed to return to full operational readiness. The M2A1 crews, following American doctrine and procedures, consistently achieved 4 rounds per minute during the sustained phase, occasionally spiking to 5 or even 6 rounds per minute during the initial high-intensity burst. More significantly, the weapon itself showed no signs of mechanical stress or degradation. The hydro-pneumatic recoil system maintained completely consistent performance across all test firings, regardless of the number of rounds fired or the rate of fire. The breech mechanism required no additional cleaning or cooling after rapid fire sequences. The barrel temperature remained within acceptable parameters. The gun could theoretically maintain this pace indefinitely, limited only by ammunition supply and crew endurance. The LFH-18 crews, firing under the same test profile with equally experienced gunners, peaked at 3 rounds per minute during the initial high-intensity burst, but dropped to approximately 2 rounds per minute during the sustained fire phase. This was not because the German crews were inferior in skill or motivation. These were veteran artillerists who knew their weapon intimately. The limitation was mechanical and procedural. The weapon demanded more physical effort for each operation. The manual breech required more time. The spring-based recoil system took longer to return the gun to battery. The crew drill, optimized for precision rather than speed, simply could not match the pace that the American system enabled. German test engineers also carefully evaluated what would later be called ergonomic factors, though that specific terminology was not yet in common usage. They documented in their reports that the M2A1's crew positions minimized movement conflicts and interference between crew members. The loader and assistant loader worked on opposite sides of the breach, never occupying the same physical space or getting in each other's way. The powder handler stood well clear of the loading sequence, able to prepare the next charge while loading was still in progress. The breach operator, who in American crews was often the same individual as the primary loader, could perform all necessary duties without requiring complex coordination or communication with other crew members. The WWII, by contrast, required more carefully choreographed teamwork. The breach operator had to manually close and lock the wedge block, then physically clear the immediate area behind the gun before the gun commander could safely order fire. The loader and assistant loader had to work in careful sequence rather than in parallel, because the breach design and ammunition handling procedure did not allow simultaneous operations. Every additional second spent in coordination, every moment of required communication between crew members, multiplied across the factors of crew fatigue, combat stress, and the chaos of battlefield conditions. The ammunition handling tests revealed yet another American advantage that might seem minor in isolation, but proved significant in sustained operations. American bagged powder charges were substantially lighter and easier to maneuver than the brass cartridge cases used in many other artillery systems, including some German designs. The M2A1 used separate loading ammunition, with the projectile inserted first, followed by the bagged powder charge. This system allowed crews to adjust propellant charges for different ranges without switching to completely different ammunition types. German separate loading ammunition operated on similar principles, but the American bag charges had been specifically designed and optimized for rapid handling. They were standardized in weight and dimension. They stacked efficiently in ammunition storage containers. They ignited consistently and reliably across a wide range of temperatures and humidity conditions. Perhaps most importantly, they produced significantly less fouling and residue buildup in the chamber and breech mechanism. The test reports meticulously noted that after 100 rounds of continuous firing, the M2A1's breech and chamber required only basic field cleaning to maintain safe and reliable operation. The WWII, after the same number of rounds, needed more intensive maintenance procedures to prevent fouling from affecting performance or safety. In combat conditions, that difference translated directly into sustained fire capability. American guns could continue shooting through extended fire missions with only brief pauses for basic maintenance. German guns required more frequent and more lengthy maintenance stops, breaking the rhythm of fire support at exactly the moments when infantry units most desperately needed continuous suppression of enemy positions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical implications of this rate of fire disparity became most clear when examining how each side actually employed artillery in combat operations during 1944. American artillery doctrine by this point in the war revolved heavily around the concept of time-on-target missions, universally abbreviated as TOT. The underlying idea was elegant in its simplicity, but devastating in its execution. Coordinate fire from multiple batteries, sometimes from entire battalions or even multiple battalions, calculating precise firing times so that all shells, despite being fired at different moments from guns at different ranges, arrived on the target simultaneously. A properly executed TOT mission could deliver 200 or more high-explosive shells onto a single objective within a 30-second window. The shock effect was overwhelming, both physically and psychologically. German infantry who survived such strikes consistently reported in after-action interrogations that TOT missions felt fundamentally different from conventional artillery barrages. There was no warning crescendo of incoming fire, no initial ranging shots that provided a few precious seconds to seek better cover or evacuate the impact area. One moment, a position was quiet. The next moment, everything within a 100-meter radius was simultaneously erupting in explosions, with no interval between impacts, no pattern to predict, no way to distinguish between the first shell and the 100th shell. The psychological impact matched and perhaps exceeded the physical destruction. German units that had learned to function under conventional artillery fire, that had developed tactics and procedures for operating in artillery-threatened environments, found themselves psychologically paralyzed by TOW strikes. There was no adaptation possible, no tactical response available. You either survived by chance, having been in a deep enough position when the strike occurred, or you became a casualty. Individual courage or tactical skill made no difference. But TOT missions only functioned as intended if your artillery pieces could fire rapidly enough to deliver the required volume of shells before the tactical opportunity window closed. If your target was enemy infantry massing for an assault, you needed to deliver overwhelming fire before that assault began. If your target was enemy artillery that had just been located by observation, you needed to deliver suppressive fire before those enemy guns could displace to a new position. Speed was not optional. Speed was the entire foundation upon which the tactic rested. German artillery doctrine in 1944 still operated fundamentally on principles, inherited from the First World War, refined and modernized certainly, but not revolutionized. A typical German fire mission began with deliberate ranging procedures. A forward observer identified a target, calculated coordinates using map and compass, and transmitted those coordinates via radio or telephone to the battery fire direction center. Fire direction personnel computed firing data, accounting for all relevant variables. Then the battery fired registration rounds, single, deliberate shots intended to bracket the target area. Forward observers watched the impact of these registration rounds and called corrections. Short or long, left or right. Fire direction recalculated. Additional registration rounds were fired until the observers confirmed that the battery had accurately ranged the target. Only after this entire registration sequence had been completed, which typically required 5 to 10 minutes under good conditions, did the fire for effect phase commence. And even then, German batteries typically fired in deliberate, controlled patterns rather than maximum rate suppression. This methodical approach maximized accuracy and minimized ammunition expenditure. It was professional. It was scientific. It reflected the careful, systematic thinking that characterized German military planning. It also gave enemy troops ample warning that they were being targeted, providing multiple opportunities to take cover, disperse, or evacuate the impact area entirely. By the time German shells began falling in effective concentration, experienced Allied infantry had already recognized the pattern and gone to ground in whatever cover was available. The careful, precise fire that seemed so professional in peacetime exercises had become predictable and, critically, slow in actual combat. Counter-battery fire illustrated this tactical gap with particular clarity. When Allied forward observers spotted German artillery positions, either through direct observation or by using sound and flash ranging techniques, they immediately called for suppression fire. American batteries could shift from their current fire mission, calculate new firing data, and begin putting rounds downrange onto the newly identified target in under 3 minutes. The first salvo might not be perfectly accurate, arriving, perhaps 50 or 75 meters from the actual gun positions. But it did not need to be surgically precise. Volume and speed compensated for any minor inaccuracy. By the time German gun crews realized they were under active counter-battery fire, shells were already impacting around their positions. The sustained American rate of fire meant that suppression was continuous, not sporadic. Shells kept arriving at 4 to 6 rounds per minute per gun, and American batteries typically massed fire from multiple guns simultaneously. German crews faced an immediate tactical choice with no good options: remain in position and continue their fire mission, accepting casualties from the incoming American counter-battery fire, or displace immediately to a new position, which meant ceasing all fire support for their own infantry and requiring 30 minutes to an hour to set up again in a new location. Either choice resulted in German guns going silent, which was precisely the American objective. When the tactical situation reversed, and German forward observers successfully identified American battery positions, The response sequence followed German doctrine. Calculate firing data carefully. Shift guns if necessary to bring the target within range. Begin registration fire. But by the time German ranging shots started landing near American positions, those American batteries had very often already completed their fire mission and begun displacement procedures. The faster-firing American guns could deliver their required fire and relocate before German counter-battery fire arrived in sufficient volume to inflict casualties or destroy equipment. The Normandy campaign in June and July of 1944, which provides the setting for the opening scene of our story, demonstrated this dynamic at full operational scale. American artillery battalions firing in support of the breakout operations, following the initial beachhead consolidation, regularly executed massed fire missions with 12 or more batteries participating simultaneously. German defenders in positions around Caen, Saint-Lô, and throughout the Bocage country reported the effect as continuous rolling thunder, a barrage that seemed to never pause or diminish. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.